6 p.m. Yes, got it.
Got it.
The 19th of August, 2021. Going to do the roll call. Jim Danhauser,
Here.
Tom Hoppenstadt,
Here?
DJ McKinnon.
Here.
Adam Zace,
Here.
Mark Lynch,
Here.
and Fran Parks, I'm here. So purpose of this evening's meeting is to get an update on the meeting that Jim and Mark had with Andy Claiborne, who's the assistant town manager, and David Anthony about the Katuitt School. So,
Mark, maybe it makes sense for me to summarize the meeting. Jackie's not with us. She was at that meeting. And Mark, then you can jump in to fix whatever I say incorrectly or to add to what needs to get added. And I apologize if I'm not going to be looking just at the screen because I want to make sure I check my notes.
Sounds good.
So we met last week with David Anthony and Andy Claiborne, as Fran had described. It took a long time for that meeting to get put together. I think it's fair to say that that is not reflective of any unwillingness on the part of the people we were meeting with to work with us to accomplish what has been described, but rather just typical government timeframes, as well as people having a lot on their plates, vacations, et cetera. But be that as it may, we had what I think was a productive meeting. It lasted well over an hour. And one of the important things we accomplished was to make sure that we set a process by which we can continue to move forward. So there's already a date set for our next meeting. Mark Ells, who's the town manager, did pop his head in at one point just to say hello, but it's clear that Andy Claiborne and David Anthony are going to be, from town management's perspective, the people who will drive the bus on trying to get something done here. We started with some review of the history of how we got to where we are. We thought that was useful because it made sure that it drove home to them how important this property is to the village of Katuitt for all of the reasons that we've all talked about at length, including particularly the proximity to the well and the impact of any development on the site on the water quality for the Katuitt Water Department and the village of Katuitt. Because I think it's important for us every occasion that we talk to people to make sure that we remind them that this is not something that we just have a passing interest in to try to get our hands on property. It's really very important, both for the water quality as well as for open space and recreation and the like. We then started by asking them why it is that the town wants to sell the property. Not necessarily to the Katuitt Fire District, just why they feel it important that they dispose of it. And they said that this was not necessarily their immediate present intention, but clearly if, first off, many members of the town council have been pressing to get properties that the town owns, which it is no longer utilizing, off the town's books. Realizing value for that and getting them back on the tax rolls. And that is particularly the case in light of the substantial financial commitments that the town's going to have in connection with the comprehensive wastewater management program. They pointed to their intention with respect to Marston's Mills, where once they demolish the school, their absolute intention is to try to sell that property to third-party developers, particularly as the sewer project goes out to that area and would significantly enhance the value of that property. So that was sort of the conversation about that. We then described the transaction that we had envisaged and had spoken to David Anthony in written communication about before. specifically an intergovernmental transfer of the property to the Katuitt Fire District of 8.5 acres, which, as we've described before, includes the wooded area and the envelope around the school building and then back out to Old Oyster Road, where the town would maintain the approximately 5 acres of other property, which includes primarily the tennis courts, the playing fields, and what we call the roadway, which is really not a road, it's a driveway. And that it was an important element of the transaction from our point of view that the town would enter into a conservation restriction with respect to the property that it retained, because that was the way that we could ensure ourselves that those assets would remain in their current state as recreational assets and would not at some future point in time be sold off and have other development take place there. At that point, it was the first time that Andy Clyburn indicated that that was something that was new to him. Although, as we know, David Anthony had certainly heard of that from us before. And more importantly, he expressed concern that that might make approval of a transaction with us more complicated from the town council's perspective, because the town council does not like to have property that the town is continuing to own with their hands tied, and conservation restrictions can be very complicated. This was not a no from their point of view, it was just an expression of concern. Jackie indicated that we have the benefit of a lot of experience in people affiliated with the Katuitt Fire District with conservation restrictions, both Jackie as well as Mark Robinson, who most of you know is on the Board of Water Commissioners, also has been in the land trust business on the Cape for a very long time and has drafted probably, as Jackie would say, more conservation restrictions than anybody else in the state of Massachusetts. He has in fact drafted one which has not been reviewed by the other water commissioners to my knowledge as yet. And we're hopeful that we'll be able to deliver a draft of that to David Anthony in advance of our next meeting with them, which I believe is scheduled for September 14th. If it's not the 14th, it's something right in and around those dates. Andy continued to push back on the notion of a conservation restriction because of the concern with respect to the town council. He said, well, why wouldn't we just do a right of first refusal, which we've done from time to time in other contexts with, for example, the Steamship Authority. Now, not everybody may be familiar with what a right of first refusal means. They're very common in real estate transactions. And frankly, it's a term of art that encompasses a broad range of possibilities. People will talk about a right of first refusal, but what it actually means depends upon how it's drafted. It could, for example, mean that if an owner decides to sell property, they will grant to whoever holds the right of first refusal, which in this case, in this hypothetical would be the Katuitt Fire District, a period of time at a specified minimum price to agree to purchase the property. Or it could be that the seller is actually required to have a third party offer in hand. And then we, as the Katuitt Fire District, would get the right to match it. I indicated that that was problematic for us. You know, he said they've done deals like that with the Steamship Authority. I said, well, we're not the Steamship Authority. We don't have a checkbook sitting immediately at hand that we could reach to exercise a right of first refusal. And depending on timeframes, it might be very complicated for us to do that. So we left it for the time being that we would continue to pursue the conservation restriction. And from their perspective, that's not a non-starter. It's just something that we all ought to be aware of that could be problematic vis-a-vis the town council. In terms of town council, they indicated that they thought it was only a majority approval, which was required, not 2/3. And so what else did we talk about? We talked about the fact that we would need to, in any deal that we did with them, we would need to maintain mutual rights of use of the roadway. We talked about the fact that they would want to reserve some space, probably at the junction with Main Street, for a pump station. They are doing that with all properties that they are disposing of that might at some point in time be adjacent to a sewer or sewer pipes. So that would be a function of any transaction they did with us. They would reserve the right for putting a pump station on property they had. Also indicated that they needed to do some research. Just, I guess the way David Anthony expressed this was that he wanted to check to make sure that there was nothing different about the enabling legislation for the Katuitt Fire District as compared to other districts that they have done intergovernmental transfers with, to confirm from their point of view that in fact, an intergovernmental transfer with us was something that was permitted under state law, which frankly came as a bit of a surprise to us because they were, you'll recall, the original parties to suggest the idea of an intergovernmental transfer. I don't believe that necessarily signals a problem, but it is something that they are going to track down from their end. And then a question we should probably wrestle with as to whether we want to track that down from our end as well, in a conversation potentially with Mark Boudreau. They also indicated that they were aware of the fact that the property was originally obtained by the town for use as a school. They were going to have to research from their side whether that would mean any particular action at a state level would be required for the town to do anything else with the property. David Anthony's suggestion was that in his view, that was unlikely to be the case because restricted use mandating state legislation typically entails something that is specific to town functions like emergencies, fire properties and other things, and has not usually been interpreted to include school properties, but that's something they will have to check. We told them that we still were waiting to get the support for the town's estimate of the demolition costs. They gave us the summary sheet, but indicated that we were free to get in touch with Dan Santos, who is the head of DPW, to get whatever support might exist behind that, because it would be useful for us to know. We also asked them once again for the report that had been done, which would indicate the level of asbestos containing material in the building, because again, that would be important primarily if we're going to be deciding to proceed with the demolition of the building, to understand what the cost of removal of that might be. The other suggestion that got made was that certainly town council processes take time. That in all likelihood, given the calendar, it was not necessarily going to be something which would be accomplished before the building would need to be heated. And that, assuming that we're all progressing towards an acceptable transaction, they would propose that we have a deal with them whereby we take on that responsibility. No surprise. I did have a separate conversation subsequently with Chief Rude, who indicated that, for at least from his point of view, that shouldn't be problematic because relatively inexpensively, he could rent equipment from Coastal Equipment Rental, blow out the pipes, and basically winterize the building at a very low cost, as opposed to having to continue to heat it. Town staff, David Anthony agreed that town staff would do the surveying work and they were going to get started on that. We also mentioned that one of the possible potential uses of the building would include a community center, the use of the gymnasium. And they indicated that they would be very happy if that were to be done to manage that for us, which I thought was an interesting concept that everybody should be aware of. And then as we continued to have dialogue with respect to the conservation restriction and the right of first refusal, both of them also said to us, well, why don't you guys just take all the property? We repeated what we have discussed before, which is that the fire district doesn't really have the infrastructure to manage those assets. And we would be looking to the town to continue to do that, as well as to maintain them. And we would also have some concern about coverage of any liability that might arise because of any accidents that might happen there, that the town could insure against that much more efficiently than we could. But that, whether it was a throwaway a lot or not, still was there as a proffered solution to not having to go through the difficulties of having a conservation restriction. That sounds easy. It's a simple document, except it's about 25 pages, very dense text. And, is something that some people would rather avoid, and particularly whether it would create any issues at the town council. I think, Mark, that was my summary of the meeting. I don't know what I missed or what I misstated, so I appreciate your correcting or expanding.
I don't think you missed anything. Just maybe a little more context and perhaps some kind of suppositions on my part that I would be interested in hearing whether you agree with. Just a quick follow-up. I did reach out to Mr. Santos. He's on vacation this week. We will connect next week with regard to whether there is any kind of background material to support that one-page summary of demolition costs. The number on that one-page PowerPoint is about $750,000. We'll wait to see if we get anything more from that. Any more detail. Hopefully there is some more, because we certainly would not want to rely on that number based on the information we have in hand. We may want to start talking about whether we need to do an RFP for demolition costs kind of in advance of finalizing this deal, so that we have a real number should demolition be the preferred option. One thing that struck me, and Andy Clyburn said it when Jim was giving his kind of summary of the village property or the school property, and mentioned that there was interest we had heard of the town selling out part of the property. He chipped in and said, "Who has said the town wants to sell it? It's never been at the top of anyone's list." And he kind of volunteered that. Over the course of the meeting was an hour and a half. Over the course of the rest of the meeting, he, I think perhaps may have realized he, put his foot in it a little bit and was emphasizing that this property was more similar to the Marston Mills property than to the Osterville property. And they were very much interested in, getting some recompense for the Marston Mills property, perhaps after it was attached to a sewerage line, which would make it more valuable. But I kind of had this sense, based on that and some other comments, that they think this would be a very wise deal for the town to enter into. I think my impression was that it was David Anthony who was the person with the initial idea to do this. The pushback about the conservation restriction, one has the sense that they would like this to be fast and easy, and a conservation restriction might be a little bit of a snag with the council. But other than that, Jim, correct me if you have a different impression. I think they would go along with the conservation restriction.
I think
Fair.
they would. They
Yeah.
would. They would definitely. Basically, they're prepared to work with us to get to town council whatever we want. That was my impression of it, and they want to proceed. They want to proceed with us as effectively as they can. I think I would say the one difference opinion I have with you, Mark, is that if they don't do a transaction with us, they will demolish the school building.
Yeah.
And then they will look to recoup costs.
Maybe. We did press them on kind of, gee, you're supposed to be looking out for our interests as well. And, this is critical from a water quality perspective. We're a little surprised that, you would perhaps step on those desires. And they said all the right things, but about preserving water quality. But Jim, I think you may be right. At the end of the day, they might do this. It's not just an idle threat. And those are my thoughts. They are interested in moving forward. They're the ones who suggested, let's get another meeting on the calendar. And, it was a fairly short turnaround. I thought it was a fruitful meeting.
Yeah, it actually would have been a week earlier, but for Labor Day. The follow-up meeting.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would say also, on a separate note, in my wearing my hat with respect to the Civic Association, we did have a meeting back in, I can't even remember anymore, July, which Mark Ells and Matt Levesque, who is the town council president, were in attendance. Consistent with my agreement with Fran, we did not talk about the Katuitt School because we, I think, rightly want to have controlled messages, one group talking to the town about this as opposed to disparate people with disparate points of view, because it can be very inefficient. We did mention the fact that obviously it was an important issue for the village, but that the Prudential Committee would be directing conversations. Prior to that meeting, Matt Levesque had actually called me and told me he wanted to assure me that from his perspective, a transaction for this property with the Katuitt Fire District would be a very good thing, and that he was fully in favor of it. Now, I hasten to add that, words are easy, votes are hard, but that at least is where I think the sense of, and I know Fran's cat wants to talk, so I'll stop in a second. But that I think is important information to have. I think there is generally a feeling at town that this is something that makes sense, and they would like to get it done. But, it has to get approved by town council. And we all know that once you get at that level, different people can have different points of view, including people who, are not necessarily associated with Katuitt. So that's the summary of the meeting. That's where we are, and love to answer anybody's questions.
So does anybody on the committee have questions for Jim or Mark? Tom?
Yeah, I'd like to just thank you both for your work. Sounds like it was a very productive meeting, very informative. Was the next meeting set for the 14th? Is that?
Yes.
Yes.
9/14. Okay, so, the wheels are going to spin a little slowly, but that's fine for everybody as long as as long as we're not concerned that there's going to be additional vandalism over at the school. There has been a little bit. And I think that's something we might need to let the town of Barnstable know that we're concerned about, given the fact that that we're in this this process, and it may end up being our property. We'd like to see it in fairly good condition.
We actually know that.
Yeah, good, excellent. So I figured they did. Yeah, I think things are going well, and it sounds like everybody's on board with the importance of the property in terms of water quality. So I think it's an excellent start. I don't really have any questions.
Do people think that we should reach out to Mark Boudreau to get his point of view with respect to the issue of the potential of an intergovernmental transfer?
I sent him a copy of the email you sent me,
Okay,
and I was going to follow up with him tomorrow to
Great.
see if he had any
Yeah.
chance to check into it.
awesome.
Mark, when is Dan Santos returning from vacation? After Labor Day?
No, he should be available next week.
Okay. So hopefully, if there's detail behind that summary sheet about the cost of demolition, so you might have some of that by the time perhaps the next time we meet,
If there is detail.
if there is detail.
If there is detail.
DJ, can I ask you a question?
Off mute. Okay.
When you go to demolish a building that has asbestos in it, do you go out for two separate bids, or is it all included in one bid, and whoever the demolishing company is, they get the asbestos people in there?
There's a couple of ways to approach it. Before you could even file to get a permit to demolish a building, you have to do a full building evaluation, which includes an analysis of any hazardous materials, including asbestos. Asbestos is usually pretty identifiable, and there are mostly unit costs that go along with it when you're dealing with different types of asbestos. And you tend to find it in things like insulation on pipes. You may find it in certain types of adhesives that we use to install windows. Sometimes you had it on the perimeter of foundations. So
And tiles.
Tiles.
So essentially, a consultant would go in and write a very in-depth report that would identify all those items. Most demolition contractors will bring in a specialty contractor to remove the asbestos. So if normally you would bid it out to a few demolition contractors, they might bid it out as a sub bid to a couple of specialty contractors that deal with it. In general, I would say it's better to go directly to the demolition contractors so that there isn't any, and have them responsible for all the demolition, including the asbestos, because if you bring in an asbestos contractor and for some reason there's a gap between what they're doing and what's under the responsibility of the main demolition contractor, you can run into issues. But so we typically will hire the consultant to go out and do the full asbestos survey and include that. We don't guarantee it, but we include that in the bid package. And then from there, just have one demolition, have bid it to demolition contractors. There's a handful of people that specialize in removing asbestos and do a pretty good job at it.
Okay, thanks.
I'm hopeful that when we get the HERA report from the town, that will accomplish that, because it was done in 2017 and specifically identifying the asbestos containing materials. So I'm hopeful that will at least eliminate that one step that DJ was referring to, which is getting the consultant in. It may sound odd that we can't get it, but it's in the school department has it, but they don't know where it is. So I finally said to them last week when we met, well, you do business with the people who did the study, just ask them. And Mark Lynch described it as the duh moment. So I am hopeful that they will now go ahead and do that.
Did they say if the town has gone out for bid for the demolishing of Marston's Mills? Or,
They did not, and we did not inquire.
okay, because I think that cost, when they get the RFPs back, will be a good indication of what it will cost in Katuitt.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Tom?
And I wouldn't shock me if the numbers, internal numbers for the Marston's Middle Schools might have had more sharpened pencils attached to them because they actually were part of an approved CIP.
I just have a question on the conservation restriction agreement. You guys would like that for your next meeting, is that correct?
It would be great if we could get it before the next meeting, get it in their hands.
Okay, thanks.
Anyone
One
else?
other thing that I might mention, Jim brought up in the meeting, the issue of the oil tank and what he always describes as the asymmetrical risk. That is, it's probably has not leaked, but if it has, it would be extremely expensive. I don't think we raised the topic, and I don't think that we kind of made that as any precondition to a deal, but we've at least left the door open. Would you say that that's a fair assessment, Jim?
Yes, and that was the reason I raised it in the way that I did. Because following on Fran's suggestion at one point, which was that if we get everything else and we don't get the underground storage tank removed and we have to bear the cost of removing it, I think we'll have done pretty well. But leaving it on the table is something that we can continue to negotiate about. It's always good to have something to give back.
We also made it clear that while the village has voted, that we should proceed with this deal, that vote was based upon certain representations on our part to the village, which is, the 8.5 acres come to us, the 5.5 acres remain with the town with the conservation easement. And the demolition, should that be our decision, would be $1 million or less. And we made it clear that certainly if any of those assumptions changed, we might have to we might have to go back and get additional or new authorization.
And that was not necessarily a conclusion that we would. But it was useful again, in matter of negotiation to have them of that view. And it might well be the case. If we can't get to a transaction that is consistent with what we've described to the voters, the Prudential Committee may decide it needs to go back, but that's obviously the Prudential Committee's decision.
I think, once we get our hands on the property, then and make a decision about, what we're going to look at as to the options for the property, demolish, fire station, community center. At that point, we'll have a district meeting.
Yep.
And get, approval for the parameters that we want to set. DJ, did you have something, a comment you wanted to make?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment. I'm not sure how much people at the town level were aware of the conservation restriction component. And you mentioned it, Andy was somewhat surprised. It doesn't surprise me that in general they have a concern with that, because although, putting a document together is one thing, essentially what it does is it tells the property owner, in this case would be the town, you're going to continue to own the property. Basically, you can't do anything with it, right? You're responsible for it. So
Right.
I can see why the town gravitated towards, why don't you just take that as well? Because, essentially if they retain ownership to it, but through a restriction, can't do anything with it, it's really a liability to them at that point. So,
Well, it
whereas-
is, but the town is in the business of having recreational assets for the town's residents. So
Yeah.
I agree that, in classic real estate sense, an owner of property doesn't like to tie up his property and be stuck owning it forever in the current format. So it is why I think we all need to continue to think about what we are prepared to do. We want to get something that gets approved by town council. I don't want to walk away from something easily, but DJ's right. These are not easy things, not just as from a documentation perspective, but from the town's perspective, somebody sitting on town council could say, well, wait a minute. We're giving them 8.5 acres. I understand, that we have a different perspective on what that transaction means, but you could see how somebody sitting on town council would say, hey, we're giving them 8.5 acres. You mean to tell me that we're going to be stuck owning these other 5 acres in perpetuity and we can never do anything with them when we're facing, a huge gun of costs for the comprehensive wastewater management program, et cetera. Now, the answers are good, that, it's a municipality. It is, these are the only recreational assets really basically in the entire town of Katuitt, the village of Katuitt,
Right.
compared to other villages on the Cape and in the town of Barnstable, and all that's true. But it may be that we need at some point in time, if we continue to get stuck on this, to think about what we would be prepared to do in the alternative. And that may include agreeing to take the whole 13.5 acres.
Yeah, well, in the meantime, we can check, the Prudential Committee can check out the cost of liability insurance for
I think that'd be great.
a public recreational spot.
I mean, I'm sure it's an add-on to the insurance we already have.
Yeah.
But it's of a different order of magnitude because, right now we're insuring, like Freedom Hall, but we're not insuring baseball fields
Yeah,
and tennis courts.
I think it's important to understand too, that the town has an incentive to keep the land as open space as part of their water management and their source protection plans. It's
Agreed.
down to the state looking at the town and saying, how many acres of open space do you have where you have watersheds that are actively being pumped? And that's something that they have to consider as well as we should be considering. And I applaud you guys for continually, making it clear to them that the water quality is of the utmost concern here. And the town has money in that game.
Absolutely.
Tax dollars drop when you don't have good water.
They tend to. Yeah.
Yeah.
So do people.
any other comments from the committee, questions?
David's talking, but he's muted.
Sorry, Jim, I wondered if you saw any opening in that remark by David Anthony that they'd be willing to manage, I don't know, the gym or a community center should we decide not to demolish. Why wouldn't they offer to also manage the tennis courts and the athletic?
David, if we took those, I think they would agree to that.
But do we have any precedent of the town assisting in the management of fire district properties?
No. No.
Right.
And I think the community center would add another liability portion
Right.
to the,
Sure.
Other than the whole town of or village of Hyannis, which is managed by the town of Barnstable. For, as their water, for their watersheds, for their fire district.
the town doesn't manage the fire district. That's
Just-
separate.
Just the,
And
Just
the
the
town
water.
doesn't manage the fire district's property.
Correct. They just took over the water.
Which is why I was somewhat surprised, David, when they suggested that they might be interested in managing the community center for us.
Yeah,
And in my notes is that very point that you just made. If they'll do that, if we decide, that the ultimate course we have to follow is to actually take that property, then is that an alternative for us to consider?
right.
So it's certainly one of the things to keep in the hopper, though to me, it would be inconsistent if you're sitting on the town council and, consistency is of course the hobgoblin of little minds. But it would be inconsistent to say, well, we don't want to keep this property forever, but here, we'll give it to you. Right? I mean, philosophically, I don't quite understand how you can come to that, those conclusions at the same time.
I would like to know why they would be particularly interested in managing the property.
Well, Jim, my recollection of that was that it was specifically in the context of if you decide to keep the gym,
Right.
we would be perhaps interested in managing that. So
That's
not,
correct.
yeah,
I'd still like to know why they'd be interested in it.
You know, Fran, I'm not sure whether it was anything more than a throwaway line, you know, by Andy, and, you know, he may well think better of it afterwards. But you know, they manage recreational facilities around town, and they have the staff to do it. And I think they recognize that there's a shortage of gyms available in this part of town, and they'd like to have their ability to get people in it. I don't think it's out of the goodness of their hearts. I think they probably think that they could have that managed and have other athletic events taking place there.
Yeah.
Intramural basketball, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
So I just also am wary of the town coming to us offering stuff.
With good reason,
Sure.
based on history.
Adam, do you want to say something? You're muted.
I'm sure the offer, should it ever be fleshed out, there was a fee hidden in there somewhere.
Oh, yeah. So. We all set?
That's all I got.
Okay. Is there any public comment? Seeing no public comment, I'll accept a motion to adjourn. Oh,
So moved.
before that, so can you let me know definitely when your next meeting is?
September 14th.
Okay, then I will set up a meeting for this. Do we know what kind of day that is?
It ends in a Y.
I think it's Tuesday.
Tuesday. So maybe I'll set up a meeting for the following Thursday.
I think it's a good idea. It's a very good idea for us to be able to update the committee while everything's fresh in our minds.
Okay. All right. Now I'll accept a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Is there a second?
seconded.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you all very much.